Hi biologists, let's start by looking at the learning objectives for this lesson. At the end of this section and following the biology syllabus, you should be able to describe the 5-kingdom classification of living things: Manara, Protista, fungi, plants and animals. What does this actually mean? What are we trying to learn? Well, basically, you have to be able to name the 5 kingdoms of living things and describe the characteristics of each kingdom. Let's look at the diversity of organisms. Diversity refers to the vast variety of living things on the planet. It really refers to the variety of life, or the variety of species in the world. Such a diversity of organisms really needs to be organised, rather like a librarian who has to organise the vast variety of books in their library. The classification of organisms means putting the organisms into groups or organising them into groups based on their similarities, in the same way that the librarian has to organise their library and put the books into groups based on what they have in common. So perhaps all the history books will go in one corner, the geography books in another corner, the detective stories in another corner. So the librarian is organising their books into groups based on their similarities. So in the same way, scientists organise the organisms or put them into groups based on what they have in common. As a matter of interest, taxonomy is the study of classification. Now, while knowing the definition of taxonomy isn't actually an objective of this lesson, it is a handy definition to know, because later on you will be required to know 3 areas of study in biology. And you could select taxonomy, the study of classification, as one of these areas. Now, what are the benefits or the advantages of organising the organisms in this way? Well, if an organism is discovered, it makes it easier to identify it. It shows how the organisms are related to each other. It gives us a greater understanding of evolution, which we will come back to later on, and makes it easier for research, as it allows the scientists to communicate with each other. In the past, the organisms were divided into 2 kingdoms, the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom, depending on whether their cells had cell walls or not. Nowadays, the organisms are classified or grouped into 5 kingdoms or 5 groups. This is proposed by the American scientist Robert Whittaker. There are 5 kingdoms or 5 groups, as we've just said, into which the living organisms are organised. The first group is Kingdom Manara, and the next kingdom is Kingdom Protista. The next kingdom is Kingdom Plantae. The next kingdom is Kingdom Fungi. And the next kingdom is Kingdom Animalia. There is a little order to this listing of kingdoms. We can see this more clearly if we look at a diagram. When we look at what I nicknamed the rabbit's ear diagram, we can see that Kingdom Manara is the first kingdom on the list. This diagram shows us that Kingdom Manara gave rise to the other 4 kingdoms. So, for example, when scientists are looking for signs of life on Mars, they're not looking or hoping to find little green men or women. They're hoping to find signs that there were bacteria on the planet once upon a time. Because if they can detect the presence of bacteria, then they can conclude that there was the possibility of life arising in Mars. So here on Earth, Kingdom Manara gave rise to all the other forms of life. This is why we list kingdom Manara first. What we're going to do next is we're going to take each one of these groups or kingdoms and look at each one in turn and discuss the characteristics of each kingdom and think about some examples from each kingdom as well. Now, looking at kingdom Manara, we need to be very careful here. A common mistake that people make is that they think this is kingdom bacteria. This is kingdom Manara. Bacteria are a collection of organisms that belong to this kingdom, but the kingdom is not kingdom bacteria, it is kingdom Manara, as we've just said. Now, what are the characteristics of kingdom Manara? Well, the first characteristic of kingdom Manara is that the cells are prokaryotic. This means they have no true nucleus. They have no membrane-bound nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. If you would like to learn a little bit more about this term, then take a look at a previous video. The organisms in kingdom Manara are also single-celled or unicellular. Unit means one, so unicellular means one cell big. Unit. They are therefore microscopic. Kingdom Manara organisms carry out asexual reproduction. What are the examples of organisms that belong to kingdom Manara? Well, as we've just said, bacteria are an example of organisms that belong to kingdom Manara. It would be no harm for you to learn the names of definite bacteria at this stage in your career, because later on in the course, when we cover ecology, we will be meeting these bacteria again. The first common bacteria that belong to kingdom Manara are the bacteria of decay. These bacteria will decay or rot away the leaves that fall during the autumn. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria take nitrogen from the air and turn it into a form which plants can use. So they take the nitrogen from the air and turn it into nitrate, which can be used by the plants. So these bacteria are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They also live in nodules or swellings of leguminous plants like peas and beans and clover. I remember these bacteria by thinking to myself, I'll fix you and make something useful out of you. So they will take the nitrogen which is useless to the plant and turn it into nitrate which is useful. The other type of bacteria are nitrifying bacteria. Now let's look at kingdom Protista. I think to myself that this is a kingdom of outliers, technically speaking, or little oddballs if you want to look at it in that way. Now these organisms are all eukaryotic, meaning they have a true proper nucleus. They have a membrane-bound nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So if we have a look here, we can think to ourselves, EU, sounds rather silly, but it helps us to remember that EU is the beginning of the word eukaryotic. We have an UE in the word true, and we have an EU in the word nucleus. So we remember EU. So kingdom Protista organisms are eukaryotic. They have a true nucleus. You can learn about this in another video on prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms. Now, the organisms that are grouped into kingdom Protista can be single-celled, but they can also be multicellular. But the main defining feature of the organisms in kingdom Protista is that they are excluded or they don't belong to any other kingdom. So they're not a bacteria, they're not a fungus, they're not a plant, They're not an animal, so we will give them a home in this kingdom of kingdom Protista because they're excluded from all other groups. So what kind of organisms belong to this kingdom? Well, first of all, we have the algae, which are basically seaweed. Now, seaweed is not a proper plant. It doesn't have stems and roots and proper leaves. So this is why it belongs in this kingdom. Protozoa, like the amoeba, which we will be studying later, the amoeba is a single-celled organism living in freshwater ponds and slow-moving streams. The amoeba is unicellular or single-celled. And the last example of organisms that are put into this kingdom are the plankton. The word plankton comes from the Greek word meaning drifter or wanderer. So plankton refers to microscopic plants and animals found out in the ocean. Again, they're outliers. They don't belong to the kingdom of plants. They're not a fungus. They're not a bacteria. They're not an animal. So how are we going to group these organisms? Well, we put them into the special kingdom, kingdom Protista. Now the next kingdom is kingdom Plantae, which is basically the kingdom of plants. A plant is an organism that usually grows in a permanent site. It doesn't move about the place. Now, it's the kingdom of plants. It is not the kingdom of flowers. Flowers are kept in a vase. Plants grow out in nature. Some of them happen to produce flowers, but there are plenty of other plants that do not produce flowers, so the word flower should not be used in connection with plants. Now, the characteristics of the plant kingdom are that the organisms in this group are eukaryotic. Again, the organisms have a true nucleus in their cells. Don't forget EU. They have cell walls around their cells that are made of cellulose. Remember, all the L's in cellulose and all the L's in cell walls. Now, plants are multicellular. They consist of many cells. A multi-story car park consists of a number of stories where you can park your car. Kingdom Plantae organisms are photosynthetic. They carry out photosynthesis and they don't move from place to place. So the organisms in Kingdom Plantae are non-motile. They can carry out asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. As we know already, asexual reproduction involves one parent and sexual reproduction involves two parents. Now, what are the examples of organisms that belong to Kingdom Plantae? Well, there are organisms called liverworts. Now, liverworts are rather interesting because they were the first plants on the planet. So they're quite primitive, really. Mosses that would grow on a tree trunk or on footpaths or on the side of your house. It's hard to imagine that they are actually plants, but they are. Ferns that you would find in a forest, and conifers, which are our Christmas trees. These are all examples of plants that are grouped into Kingdom Plantae. And lastly, we have all the plants that produce flowers. These are called flowering plants. And as we have said before, flowering plants are plants that happen to produce flowers, not to be called flowers. These are things in a vase and that you give to your mother on Mother's Day. A Latin word or a more scientific word for flowering plants is the term angiosperms. Now, the next kingdom we're looking at is Kingdom Fungi. Again, what are the characteristics of Kingdom Fungi? Well, the cells of the fungi are eukaryotic. They have a true nucleus. Now, fungi actually have cell walls, but this time the cell walls are made of a material called chitin, not cellulose, because if the cell walls were made of cellulose, then the organisms would be a plant. Their bodies quite often are composed of threads which are called hyphae, and fungi do not carry out photosynthesis. They have no chlorophyll. They have no green colour. Fungi absorb their food. They cannot make their own food, so fungi are heterotrophic. And the last characteristic is that they can reproduce by making spores. So what types of organisms are grouped into kingdom fungi? Well, mushrooms belong to kingdom fungi. So do molds, like bread molds, which we will be learning about later. Yeast that is used in baking, for an example, is actually a fungus. And lastly, what are the characteristics of kingdom Animalia? Well, all the organisms in this group are all eukaryotic. Again, they have a true nucleus. You should have noticed at this stage that all the kingdoms except kingdom Manara are eukaryotic. Animal cells have no cell walls, and animals are multicellular. They consist of many cells. There are no unicellular animals. If there are organisms that are unicellular and have no cell walls and are eukaryotic, then they're going to belong in kingdom Protista. Animals do not carry out photosynthesis. They have only one type of reproduction. They do sexual reproduction involving two parents, and they exhibit or they show nervous coordination. They have some sort of a brain and some sort of nervous structure. They are the only kingdom to exhibit or show nervous coordination. So what organisms are put into kingdom Animalia? Well, as a matter of interest, in case some people are doing ag science, flatworms, flat as a pancake, like liver fluke, are classified into this group or put into this kingdom. A lot of people don't consider that earthworms are actually animals, so this is why I have included them here. Earthworms are animals, mollusks or snails are animals, our creepy crawly friends, insects are actually animals, which a lot of people don't realise. Arthropods, the scientific word for insects, comes from pod, meaning leg, and arthro, which means jointed. So insects have jointed legs. And lastly, all normal animals that we're familiar with, cats and dogs, horses, cows and sheep. And don't forget, things like fish and snakes, which you might not expect, belong to kingdom animals because they all have a nervous cord. There you have it. Practice in a jotter. Now that we have reached the end of our lesson, have we achieved our objective? Can you describe the 5 kingdom classification of living things? Manara, Protista, fungi, plants and animals.